He thought no one would find out. That he could quietly reroute my children's college fund and blame the market when it vanished. But he forgot who he was dealing with. I don't scream. I don't plead. I prepare. My name is Vanessa James. I'm 32 years old, a widow, and a mother of two, Lucas, 12, and Aria, 9. I've spent the last 8 years living with a quiet kind of purpose, building a life for my children after my husband passed unexpectedly. I don't live extravagantly, but I manage our finances with discipline and care. My late husband, Andrew, left behind a life insurance policy, and I put every cent of it toward the kids' education fund. It was sacred. Untouchable. Or so I thought. It started with a phone call I almost didn't answer. "Hi Ms. James, this is Claire with Meriton Financial. I just need to verify some details regarding the recent withdrawal request on the $529 college fund for Lucas and Aria James." I froze. Withdrawal? I hadn't requested anything. My voice was calm when I replied, but inside, my body had gone cold. "I'm sorry, what request?" She hesitated. "The one authorized last Friday. It was processed through the trustee, Mr. David James. My brother." I ended the call, my hands shaking only slightly. I'd made him co-trustee years ago, before I fully understood what that power could mean in the wrong hands. He was family. He'd helped me through Andrew's funeral. He'd coached Lucas's soccer team for 2 seasons. I never thought he would steal from my children. But that's exactly what he had done. The paperwork arrived by mail the next morning. His signature was on the form. A clean, competent scrawl I knew too well. $148,000 transferred out. Labeled, reallocation for higher yield investments. I couldn't speak. Not yet. Not until I was sure. So I waited. Watched. And listened. At Sunday dinner, I looked across the table at him. His wife, Courtney, was chattering about their upcoming renovation. We finally pulled the trigger, remodeling the kitchen and putting in the skylights David's always wanted. I swallowed my disgust. My children's future was funding their backsplash. Later that evening, I stood in the garage watching Lucas shoot hoops against the cracked concrete wall. Aria sat nearby with her sketchpad, humming softly as she drew. They didn't know. They couldn't know, not yet. But I'd made a decision. I called my lawyer Monday morning. "Tell me what I need to do," I said. My voice didn't shake. "We're going to make this right. Quietly. Legally. And permanently." I started pulling every statement, every bank document, every signature authorization I had. I worked at night while the kids slept, highlighting dates, notarized forms, and expense reports from David's business, if you could call it that. A consulting firm that had never turned a profit, yet always seemed to have new gadgets and luxury expenses. The more I uncovered, the clearer it became, this wasn't an isolated mistake. It was a pattern. David had been siphoning small amounts from multiple family accounts for years, quietly enough that no one noticed. And now, he'd gone too far. What he didn't realize was that I'd kept records. All of them. Because Andrew had taught me to. We both came from families that understood appearances better than accountability. So we built our marriage on transparency. Honesty. Protection. And that meant every transaction involving our children was backed by documentation and locked away. I found an old email David had sent after I named him co-trustee. "You can always count on me, Ness," he'd written. "Anything for the kids." I printed it and added it to the growing pile on my dining table. By the end of the week, I had everything I needed. The lawyer, Dana, looked over the documents and whistled under her breath. "This isn't just recoverable," she said. "It's damning. If he doesn't return every cent, we'll take him to court, and I'll enjoy watching the judge's face when we show this." But I wasn't ready to go nuclear. Not yet. David deserved one chance to face what he'd done. Not a fight. A reckoning. I planned it carefully. The location. The people present. The timing. When I finally told him to meet me, he assumed I wanted to discuss holiday plans or perhaps needed more help with the kids. He didn't expect to walk into my lawyer's office and find a stack of documents waiting with his name on them. What he said in that room, the excuses he gave, the way he tried to twist the truth, still echoes in my head. But nothing prepared me for what he tried to do next. And I wasn't prepared for how far he'd go to protect himself. Or how much more I'd have to lose before this ended. And yet, I didn't waver. Because when someone steals from your children, there is no forgiveness. Only resolve. Some betrayals come with a scream. Others arrive with silence and a signature. He sat across from me in Dana's office, the same practiced smirk he wore when bluffing through poker games as a teenager. It hadn't aged well. I remember watching the way his hands fidgeted near the cufflinks, overcompensating, anxious. His confidence began to shrink with each document we slid across the table. But it wasn't the legal jargon or the accounting lines that disturbed me most. It was the absence of apology. He said, "You're overreacting." I replied, "You stole from Lucas and Arya. That's not something I can underreact to." Dana stayed composed beside me, flipping calmly through the next section of evidence. She spoke in measured, unshakable sentences, her voice a kind of protection I hadn't realized I needed. She'd warned me that some people don't panic when caught. They pivot. Reframe. Pretend. And David, true to form, attempted all three. He claimed it was a miscommunication. That he'd been trying to invest the money to grow the fund. That he would have replaced it eventually. But there is no version of reality where my brother had the right to touch that money. No moral world where skylights take precedence over college tuition. After that meeting, he didn't call me. He didn't text. He didn't explain himself to our mother, who still believed we were so close. Instead, 2 days later, I received a message from his wife. She said, "We're going to have to take a step back from family events for a while. It's a tense time." No apology. Just distance, like that might dilute the damage. That weekend, I stayed up late combing through old journals. Pages I'd scribbled after Andrew died. Notes about the kids' milestones. My savings goals. Dreams I had promised myself I wouldn't bury under grief. One page stopped me cold. A list we'd made the week after Lucas was born, names of people we trusted, for godparents, guardians, emergency contacts. David's name was near the top. I crossed it out with a red pen. Not because it changed the past, but because I needed to see the line. To remind myself that trust, once broken, deserves to be acknowledged as such. A few days later, my mother invited me to brunch. She didn't mention the situation, didn't need to. Her text came with the usual breezy pretense, "We need to catch up, darling. It's been too long." The restaurant was crowded, loud, expensive. She always chose places like that. I arrived early, ordered tea, and waited. When she walked in wearing a silk scarf I hadn't seen before, I already knew what this brunch was really about. She didn't ask how I was. Didn't ask about Lucas's science project or Arya's sketchbook collection. She went straight to David. She said, "He's under so much stress lately. Courtney's health hasn't been great, and the business, well, you know how hard it is to stay afloat these days." I didn't flinch. I stirred my tea slowly, the metal spoon tapping gently against porcelain. She leaned in, voice low, as if someone might overhear. "He told me there was confusion. That you're taking things personally." I said nothing. She added, "Maybe this is just a misunderstanding, Vanessa. Family has to find a way to move past these things." It was astonishing, really. Her ability to compress betrayal into an inconvenience. Something to be managed for the sake of appearances. I thought of Andrew then. The way he used to squeeze my hand under the table when family dinners got too performative. We'd share a private smile, the kind that says, "We know the truth." Let them pretend. I missed him more in that moment than I had in months. Later that night, I sat with Lucas at the dining table, helping him with algebra. Arya curled beside us with a book, legs tucked under, lost in some magical world. Their presence steadied me. Because no matter how twisted the adult dynamics became, I knew what I was fighting for. Still, I couldn't ignore the ache that lingered, the kind that grows not from the act of theft itself, but from what it reveals. David hadn't just taken money. He had gambled on my silence. Counted on it. And I realized then, this was never about money to him. It was about power. About believing he had a right to take from the person he assumed would never push back. And he wasn't alone in that assumption. The next week, I received a formal letter. Not from David. From our uncle, Greg. A man who'd once told me I was as sharp as your father, but without the entitlement. The letter was brief. He wanted to help mediate the situation, as he put it. Families shouldn't be dragging each other into legal fights, especially when emotions are running high. I folded the letter and tucked it into the drawer with the others. I wasn't alone. I had Dana. I had my children. But emotionally, the isolation was growing. Phone calls from cousins stopped. Invites dried up. I became the subject of quiet caution. The relative who was suing her brother. The one who took things too far. One evening, as I walked back from the mailbox, I saw David's car parked outside my mother's house. His silhouette in the window. I watched them laugh, heads leaned close, wine glasses in hand. And it struck me, how easily some people compartmentalize harm. How efficiently they rewrite the story when it suits their comfort. That night, I didn't cry. I reorganized the kids' college documents. I reviewed the new trust Dana helped me set up, one with ironclad protections. I added secondary custodians. I included a clause that would notify me immediately of any access attempt. And I added a note to my own will. I wasn't just cleaning up the mess. I was building a fortress. But something was still unfinished. Something I hadn't let myself feel fully. The betrayal wasn't just his. It was theirs too, the ones who stayed silent. Who looked away. Who chose peace over justice. That realization, that was the beginning of something I couldn't unsee. And what came next, I didn't plan. It came quietly. Unexpectedly. But it changed everything. Sometimes silence is just another weapon. And my family wielded it with expert precision. The weeks that followed were eerily quiet. No more letters. No more veiled warnings. Just a steady, deliberate pulling away. It felt like stepping into a room where someone had just finished whispering about you, but they'd already put their masks back on. Smiling. Dismissive. Unbothered. And yet, something was different. The absence no longer stung. It clarified. The loneliness I once feared became air I could breathe. I stopped checking my phone for messages that wouldn't come. I no longer hesitated before saying no. No to the brunches. No to the passive-aggressive invitations. No to being the woman who keeps swallowing fire just to keep others warm. Still, the pressure didn't disappear. It just changed form. Lucas came home from school one afternoon with furrowed brows and a question too mature for his age. Is Uncle David in trouble? I looked up from the kitchen counter, where I was packing lunch boxes for the next day. He said, Sam told everyone at recess that his dad said Uncle David's being sued for stealing. I paused, met his eyes, and answered with the truth, not all of it, but enough. I told him that sometimes grown-ups make choices that hurt people, and that when they do, those choices have consequences. He didn't ask anything else. Just nodded, then went to his room. But that night, after they were asleep, I cried for the first time in weeks. Not because I doubted my decision. Because my children had to carry the weight of someone else's greed. That's when the messages started, quiet, subtle intrusions. An anonymous account tagging me in vague quotes online about forgiveness, about family, about women who poison bloodlines with litigation. I knew it was them. Or someone close to them. A cousin, perhaps, trying to inject shame through scripture-laced commentary and motivational platitudes. One even posted a photo from a family gathering I hadn't been invited to, with the caption, "Only love makes a family." I didn't engage. I archived. I documented. When you grow up female in a family like mine, you learn early that emotional manipulation rarely arrives dressed like conflict. It comes wrapped in guilt. In duties. In coded silence. Dana noticed. She called after receiving a cryptic voicemail from someone claiming to be a concerned relative. She said, "They're testing you. Looking for signs you're wearing down. Don't respond." I said, "I won't." But the isolation was real. Even friends I'd known for years began walking carefully around the subject. One of them, Julia, pulled back entirely. I'd been her maid of honor 5 years ago, held her hand through a brutal divorce, but now she didn't return my calls. I learned later that her husband had gone into business with David last year. A small investment. Nothing much. But enough to make my side of the story inconvenient. I wasn't angry. I was done being surprised. What I didn't expect, though, was Rachel. She was my neighbor. Single mother. Former paralegal turned wellness coach. We'd nodded at each other for years over backyard fences and polite PTA greetings. But one afternoon, she brought over a loaf of homemade bread and asked if I had time for tea. She didn't pry. Didn't ask questions. She just talked, about her garden, about the book she loved, about her son and the absurdity of middle school drama. It was ordinary. Which made it sacred. Later, as I walked her back to the porch, she paused. She said, "Sometimes the people who preach family unity are the ones most afraid of accountability." I looked at her then, really looked, and realized she understood more than she let on. After she left, I opened the windows, let the late spring breeze drift through the house, and felt something loosen in my chest. Still, the pressure kept building elsewhere. Lucas came home with a flyer for a school science camp, tuition due in 4 weeks. Aria needed braces. The weight of single motherhood had always been manageable with careful planning, but the legal fees, the meetings, the time, none of it came without cost. I wasn't drowning. But I was tightening belts. At night, I did freelance financial consulting to make up the gap. I worked quietly, efficiently. There was a strange relief in it, no noise, just numbers. Clean. Honest. Uncomplicated. Then came the second blow. Dana called me on a Monday morning. I remember the way the coffee tasted, bitter, burnt, almost sour. She said, "You should know. David's filed a petition to assume temporary financial guardianship over the college fund." I said nothing. She added, "He's claiming the money was mismanaged. That you've compromised the fund's growth by keeping it idle during inflation." I stared at the calendar on the wall, the little star Aria had drawn on the date of her school art show. He wasn't just trying to take the money. He was trying to rewrite the story. Paint me as irresponsible. Unfit. Turn the courtroom into his redemption stage. And I knew then, this wasn't about the children anymore. It was about control. If he couldn't have the money, he would try to take my credibility. My standing. My motherhood. And still, I didn't panic. I documented. I called Dana. We reviewed the full paper trail. Every fund transfer. Every balance sheet. Every decision I'd made with certified oversight. She said, "He won't win. But it'll get messy." I replied, "Then let it get messy." I spent the rest of the day reviewing files. Pausing only once to look out the window and watch Lucas toss a football to himself in the yard. He was growing taller every week. Aria sat nearby with her sketchpad, her forehead furrowed, tongue slightly out, deeply focused. They had no idea what was coming. And for the first time I was glad. Because they didn't need to carry this with me. They just needed to know that I'd carry it for them. I closed the laptop that night with a final click. Clean. Final. And then, I made one more call. Not to Dana. Not to Rachel. To someone I hadn't spoken to in years. But someone who owed me a favor. Because I wasn't going to let this go to trial if I could help it. There was still one card I hadn't played. Revenge doesn't always come with fire. Sometimes, it walks in dressed like preparation. The favor I called in came with strings, but I didn't hesitate. His name was Miles, an estate lawyer I once helped through a quiet divorce years ago, back when I was still volunteering legal research hours on the weekends. He owed me, and I reminded him gently. I said, I need someone to look at David's finances. Quietly. Thoroughly. He didn't ask questions. Just said he'd be in touch by the end of the week. While he worked, I prepared in my own way. I kept the children's lives as normal as possible. School drop-offs, parent-teacher conferences, evening routines. But behind the curtain, my world had narrowed into spreadsheets, legal briefs, and strategy. Dana and I met every Tuesday at her office. We'd sit by the window, piles of folders between us, cross-referencing every clause of the trust David was attempting to hijack. We studied precedents. We highlighted risk language. We walked the line between caution and confrontation. I wasn't afraid of losing. I was afraid of what he would take in the process, the narrative, the sympathy, the version of events that would live in whispers long after the court closed. That was the real theft. The rewriting of character. Miles called that Thursday evening. He sounded tired but sharp. He said, Vanessa, your brother's business account is bleeding. He's taken 3 personal loans in the last 8 months. 2 are delinquent. 1 is from a private lender with interesting connections. I let the silence stretch before I asked, does he know you've accessed any of this? He said, no. But he will soon. I exhaled slowly. This wasn't about punishing him. It was about creating leverage. Making sure he understood what would come to light if he kept pushing. Because men like David don't respond to shame. They respond to exposure. I documented everything. Every expense he'd funneled into that renovation, down to the imported tiles for their bathroom and the luxury oven with gold-trimmed knobs. My children's futures traded for aesthetic flair and Instagram aesthetics. I added screenshots to my folder. Receipts. Loan documents. I printed the photos from his wife's social media showing off their self-funded remodel. Dana raised an eyebrow when she saw them. She said, he's either arrogant or desperate. I replied, both. We filed a formal response to his petition. It included a motion for full financial discovery. If he proceeded, the court would demand complete transparency, his assets, liabilities, business records, all under scrutiny. The next day, he withdrew the petition. No apology. No explanation. Just a curt notice through his attorney. But I knew better. That wasn't surrender. That was recalibration. 2 days later, Aria came home with a note in her backpack. A friend's mother had invited her over to bake cookies and decorate crafts. Harmless. Except that the mother was Courtney's sister. I hesitated. Was it coincidence? Manipulation? Or just childhood innocence pulling strings adults couldn't see? I told Aria she could go, but I drove her myself. Stayed in the car. Waited. She came back smiling, fingers dusted with flour, holding a glitter-covered ornament she'd made. She said, Mrs. Ellen was really nice. She said I'm always welcome. I nodded, even as my stomach twisted. Because kindness, when misused, is just another strategy. The following week, a family friend reached out, someone I hadn't spoken to since Andrew's funeral. His name was Leo, and he'd worked with Andrew on several nonprofit boards. He said, I heard what's happening with David. I don't know all the details, but if there's anything you need. I thanked him, and we talked for nearly an hour. Not just about the case, but about Andrew, his sense of humor, his integrity, the way he believed in slow, quiet progress. After the call, I sat in the kitchen for a long time, watching the steam rise from my tea. I missed him in waves. Not the ache of early grief, but the sharp absence of someone who would have stood beside me in this. Who would have looked David in the eye and said, "You don't touch what's sacred." But grief becomes strategy, if you let it. And mine had become fuel. I called Dana the next morning and asked her to draft a formal letter to the family, not just David. To everyone. A full accounting of the events, the financial evidence, the actions taken. Not emotional. Just facts. Professional. Cold. I said, if they're going to keep whispering, let them whisper about something true. We mailed it to 11 households. I didn't expect responses. But I got one. A letter. Handwritten. From Aunt Margaret, my mother's older sister. She said, "I've stayed quiet too long. I remember when your father died, how you handled everything with strength no one your age should have needed. I didn't speak up then. I regret that. I see what you're doing now, and I want you to know, some of us are watching. And we believe you." I read it twice. Then folded it neatly and placed it in the drawer with the legal documents. Not because it was evidence. Because it was something I hadn't allowed myself to feel in months. Validation. Then, 2 days before the formal mediation, David sent me a message. Not through his lawyer. Directly. A single sentence. He said, "You're turning everyone against me." I didn't reply. Because I wasn't. He had done that all on his own. The morning of the mediation, I wore a navy dress and low heels. Neutral. Professional. Dana met me outside the building, folder in hand, expression unreadable. Inside, the conference room smelled like citrus cleaner and cold coffee. David arrived 10 minutes late, alone. He didn't speak to me. Didn't look at me. We began. Each statement was read. Each document acknowledged. His attempts to interrupt were dismissed by the mediator. Dana remained calm, lethal. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. By the end, it was clear, he had no path forward. No claim. No defense. But he wouldn't concede. Not really. He said, "You always thought you were better than us." I replied, "No. I just refused to become what you did." The mediator cleared her throat. The session adjourned. He walked out without a word. And I stood by the window, staring at the city below, feeling the shift. It wasn't over. Not yet. But something had cracked. And in the space where fear used to live, I felt something else rise. Something solid. Something final. Some people crumble when the mask slips. Others double down. David chose the latter. The day after mediation, he showed up at my door. No warning. No appointment. Just his car idling crookedly in front of my house like he barely stopped thinking long enough to park it straight. I opened the door halfway, left the screen between us. Lucas was upstairs working on a science project. Aria was on the couch drawing in her sketchbook with her headphones on. I didn't want them to hear his voice. He didn't look me in the eye. He said, "This has gone too far." I didn't answer. He said, "You think you've won, but you haven't. You're just dragging the whole family through mud." I said, "You did that when you stole from my children." He flinched, just barely, and for a second I thought maybe there was a flicker of something, remorse, understanding, anything human. But it passed. He stepped closer, and the screen door groaned slightly under his weight. I didn't move. He said, "You think people are on your side now? Wait until they see how bitter you really are." I said nothing. Just watched him. Because I finally understood, this wasn't about redemption. It wasn't about money anymore. It was about punishment. He couldn't accept that I had done what he thought I'd never do, stood up without flinching. Fought back without apology. Dismantled his illusion of control. I closed the door quietly. Locked it. He stood there for a while longer. Then left. That night, I didn't sleep. Not from fear. From clarity. Because I knew what had to come next. Dana and I met again on Thursday. We reviewed every document for the last time. No more edits. No more revisions. The confrontation was no longer theoretical. We had a formal hearing scheduled, family court, public record. She said, "He's going to try to discredit you. Not with facts. With noise." I replied, "Then let him scream." The courtroom was smaller than I expected. Clean lines, beige walls, uncomfortable chairs. It felt more like a clinic than a battlefield. I wore black slacks, a slate gray blouse, and tied my hair back low and neat. Dana looked sharp, composed, already flipping through her binder before we sat down. David arrived with a new attorney. More aggressive than the last. A man who leaned back with his arms spread like he owned the oxygen in the room. But his confidence faltered once the judge entered, an older woman with silver hair, severe glasses, and zero patience for performance. Testimony began. David's lawyer tried to paint a picture of financial mismanagement on my part. He cited inflation. Claimed I was emotionally compromised. Tried to present my refusal to liquidate certain funds as negligent, suggesting I was clinging to emotional sentiment over practical growth. Dana countered with exact figures. Growth percentages. Conservative portfolio allocations. Independent reviews from 2 financial advisors. Certified audits. Every claim was buried under math. Then they pivoted. He said, "Your Honor, we believe Ms. James has used this situation to isolate the children from their extended family. There's emotional harm in that." Dana didn't even blink. She pulled out school records. Letters from pediatricians. A brief from the children's therapist, confirming stability and emotional health. I didn't speak. I didn't need to. But then David stood. He said, "She's always been like this. Cold. Controlling. Vindictive." He looked directly at me. His face twisted, not with anger, but something deeper. Entitlement unmasked. He said, "She uses her grief like a weapon." Everything with Andrew became a monument. Untouchable. Including the money. And for the first time since this began, I spoke. I said, "That money wasn't Andrew's. It wasn't mine. It belonged to our children. You just thought no one would notice when you reached for it." The room went still. Even the judge looked up. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't cry. I just let the words hang. The judge adjourned for a short break, and Dana and I stepped outside into the hallway. The fluorescent lights buzzed above us, and the vending machine hummed nearby. Dana handed me a bottle of water, her eyes calm. She said, "He's unraveling." I nodded. We both knew what came next. The judge reconvened quickly. Summaries were presented. The petition was denied, and a formal rebuke was entered into the record. The court reaffirmed my sole authority over the educational trust. Dana requested that a note be added regarding David's prior unauthorized access, citing it as a breach of fiduciary trust. The judge agreed. It was over. On paper, at least. David didn't look at me when we stood to leave. His shoulders were stiff, jaw set. But there was something small in the way he walked. A loss not of the battle, but of his own illusion. He'd underestimated the quiet woman. The grieving wife. The mother with receipts. Outside, the sun was blinding. Dana shaded her eyes with one hand, then turned to me. She said, "You did it." I looked down at the courthouse steps, the same ones I'd walked with Andrew years ago when finalizing our will. I said, "It was never about winning." She looked at me, confused. I said, it was about telling the truth. In a room where it finally mattered. We parted ways, and I drove home with the windows down. The wind in my hair. A strange stillness in my chest. Lucas was on the porch when I pulled in. Arya beside him, sketchpad balanced on her knees. They both looked up. And something in their expressions told me they knew. Not the details. Not the law. But the weight of what I had protected. We ate dinner quietly that night. Then watched a movie on the couch, all three of us curled into a tangle of limbs and soft blankets. At one point, Arya reached over and took my hand without looking. She said, "Mom, are we okay now?" I replied, "Yes. We are." But even then, I knew that victory leaves echoes. And some things were still shifting. Winning doesn't erase damage. It just gives you the space to begin cleaning it up. In the weeks after the hearing, the silence was different. Not cold this time, hushed, cautious, like the family was waiting to see if I would twist the knife. But I had no appetite for vengeance. The court had said what I needed it to say. The money was secure. The truth was on record. That was enough. What remained was something less public, more difficult to untangle, the personal aftermath. David didn't reach out. Not even once. His name came up only through whispers, passed through mutual acquaintances or half-hearted relatives who still insisted that he meant well, as if intention could erase impact. I didn't reply to their messages. I didn't explain. If someone needed me to justify defending my children, they were never in my corner to begin with. One afternoon, while Arya was at art club and Lucas at soccer, I sat alone in the kitchen going through a stack of mail. The top envelope was handwritten, postmarked from Courtney. I paused, then opened it. The note was short. Polite. Almost sterile. She said, "I regret that things became so adversarial. I hope, in time, we can find a way to move forward for the sake of the children." There was no apology. Just a request for future convenience. I placed the letter in the drawer with the others and closed it softly. Not all bridges needed burning. But this one? It needed a gate. Locked. A few days later, my mother called. It was a Sunday morning, just after I'd finished folding laundry. Her name flashing on the screen felt like a pulse from another life, distant, but familiar. I answered. She didn't mention David. Didn't bring up the hearing. Instead, she asked if I'd considered coming to the annual family brunch that summer. I said, no. She said, "People miss you." I said, "They had their chance to show that." There was a pause. Then, quietly, she said, "You've changed." I replied, "I had to." The call ended there. Cordially. Coldly. Like a formal negotiation. I sat still for a while after that, wondering what kind of mother lets her daughter fight a war alone, then asks her to come home with a smile. But some wounds don't beg for bandages. They demand boundaries. Legally, David had no recourse left. Dana confirmed the trust had been restructured under new custodial protections, and that any future interference would be grounds for criminal fraud. The children's accounts were now locked tighter than ever, bulletproof. I updated my will. Reassigned all roles. Appointed Rachel, my neighbor, as emergency guardian. She wept when I asked her. Not from flattery. From the weight of trust. She said, "You don't have to be alone in this anymore." I believed her. We began meeting for coffee every other week. Nothing intense. Just quiet conversation and the occasional shared frustration about homework or rising grocery prices. Her presence was grounding. The children adjusted well. Lucas became more focused, more protective of Arya. I saw it in small gestures, how he always waited by her locker after school, how he checked her backpack for forgotten books. He never asked about David again. Arya, on the other hand, began drawing families with fewer faces. Sometimes just the three of us. Sometimes just me and her. I didn't ask. I didn't need to. Their resilience was my compass. My reminder that the real inheritance I was fighting for had nothing to do with money. It was stability. Trust. Safety. In early spring, I got a message from Leo, the friend of Andrew's who had reached out months earlier. He invited me to speak at a local community panel on financial literacy for single parents. I hesitated. I wasn't looking to be anyone's cautionary tale. But then I thought about the nights I'd spent combing through documents with my eyes burning, my back aching, terrified of making a mistake. If I could help even one other woman avoid what I'd endured, maybe it was worth it. The panel was held in a church basement with bad lighting and weak coffee. But the room was full. Dozens of women. Some with strollers. Some alone. All of them listening. I spoke simply. About trust structures. About documentation. About never assuming family meant safety. Afterward, a young woman approached me. She was 24. Her father had drained her daughter's college savings without telling her. She said, "I thought it was my fault. That maybe I hadn't managed things well enough." I looked her in the eyes and said, "People like that count on your silence. Don't give it to them." When I got home that evening, Lucas was waiting with a project he wanted me to proofread. Aria had drawn a new picture, this one of a house with sunflowers and our cat curled in the window. 3 stick figures stood out front, holding hands. She said, "That's us." I kissed the top of her head and nodded. The house no longer felt like a battlefield. It felt like a sanctuary. And yet, the final thread tugged loose a week later. Uncle Greg called. The one who'd written that awful letter months ago, suggesting we mediate quietly. He said, "I just wanted to say. I was wrong. I should have looked closer." I didn't say much. Just thanked him. Not because I forgave him. But because accountability, however late, still matters. And as spring warmed into early summer, the noise faded. The whispers quieted. Even the online shade, those anonymous posts and vague guilt trips, disappeared. Maybe they'd grown tired. Maybe the truth had finally rooted deep enough to outlast opinion. One afternoon, while clearing out old boxes in the garage, I found a photo of Andrew holding Lucas as a baby. His eyes were tired. His smile soft. I framed it and placed it on the mantel, just above the bookshelf Aria had filled with her sketches. There was no need for revenge anymore. Because the most powerful outcome had already arrived. My children were safe. And David, he would never touch that again. But something else had shifted inside me too. A voice I hadn't heard in years was beginning to return. Not grief. Not anger. Something quieter. Something that sounded like possibility. Peace doesn't always arrive like a sunrise. Sometimes, it's just the absence of the next disaster. The photo of Andrew stayed on the mantel. Not as a monument, but as a presence. A reminder of who we were, of what I promised when I held our children alone for the first time in that hospital room. I hadn't broken that promise. I'd bent beneath it, yes. I'd wept over it. But I had carried it through fire. I didn't tell many people how it ended with David. That part of the story no longer belonged in public spaces. It belonged where all hard-won truths eventually live, deep inside, tucked behind the kind of silence that's earned, not imposed. Court documents were finalized. Funds remained untouched. No more anonymous messages. No more half-hearted apologies. But I noticed something stranger than hostility, retreat. People who had once circled me like spectators began looking away. Not with shame, something else. A quiet discomfort. As if surviving with your dignity intact makes others examine their own choices too closely. I didn't mind. I had no interest in belonging to rooms where loyalty was conditional. My world became smaller, but more deliberate. Rachel and I built a routine. Early morning walks before the kids woke up. Grocery trips together. Even weekend hikes with our daughters, who had started bonding over books and shared eye rolls at adult seriousness. Lucas joined a robotics club. Aria submitted one of her drawings to a national contest and placed third. We celebrated with pancakes and sparkling water in mismatched mugs. At night, I read again. Real books, not legal briefs. Fiction that made me laugh. Memoirs that made me cry. I remembered, slowly, the version of myself that existed before the war. The part of me that wasn't defined by defending what was mine. One afternoon, I sat down with the children and went over our new family plan. Updated wills. Trust structures. Guardianship details. I didn't frame it as a lecture. Just a conversation. Lucas listened closely, nodding like a little man. Aria asked if the cat was included in the will. I told her yes. We all laughed. Later, as I was cleaning up dinner, Lucas lingered behind. He said, "You always take care of everything." I dried my hands, turned to him. I said, "Not everything. Just what matters." He nodded, then went upstairs. I stood there for a long time afterward, staring at the quiet house. The weight of legacy no longer felt heavy. Just clear. A few weeks later, I was invited to speak again, this time, not about financial literacy, but about personal resilience. It was a smaller group. Mostly women in their 40s, many of them caregivers, all carrying some version of invisible survival. I told them the truth. That protection isn't just about locking doors or drawing boundaries. Sometimes it's about saying the thing you were taught never to say. You hurt me. And I'm done pretending that's okay. After the talk, a woman hugged me in the parking lot. Her sister had stolen from her. Her mother had sided with the thief. She said she'd thought about walking away for years. She said, "Hearing you made me feel like it's not betrayal to save yourself." I squeezed her hand. I didn't say much. But I saw myself in her eyes. The ripple of this kind of story isn't loud. It doesn't trend. It moves in quiet circles. One woman to another. One whispered truth at a time. Back home, I began preparing for fall. School supplies. Calendar meetings. I even signed up for a pottery class, something I hadn't done since college. The kids noticed. Aria said I seemed lighter. Lucas started calling me Commander Mom, half jokingly, half admiringly. And I started smiling without catching myself first. Then, out of nowhere, I received an email from my cousin Nadine. One of the ones who disappeared when things got uncomfortable. She said, "I know I wasn't there. I'm sorry. I was scared of choosing sides. But I see you now. I see what you did. I hope it's not too late to say I admire you." I didn't reply right away. I reread it 3 times. Then closed my laptop and sat with it for a day. Forgiveness doesn't have to be immediate. But acknowledgement, that mattered. I wrote back eventually. Not to reopen the door, but to nod through it. A signal. That growth was possible, even now. By late autumn, our lives had settled into a rhythm again. No sharp edges. Just days layered gently, like leaves softening the ground. I never heard from David again. Courtney posted less frequently. The house they renovated was listed quietly 6 months later, and I heard through a neighbor that they'd downsized. I didn't feel triumphant. Just still. Because justice, for me, wasn't about watching them fall. It was about making sure they couldn't pull us down with them. One evening, as rain tapped against the windows and the children slept, I made tea and sat by the framed photo of Andrew. I lit a small candle beside it, something I hadn't done in years. I whispered, "They're safe." I kept my promise. The flame flickered gently in reply. I've stopped waiting for the past to explain itself. Some questions won't be answered. Some wounds won't be mended. But I am no longer asking for apologies from people who specialize in silence. I am asking something else. What kind of woman will I become now that I'm no longer surviving? What do I want to build, now that the fire has passed? The answers are still forming. Slowly. Quietly. But for the first time in years, I am not afraid of what comes next. And that is enough.